Okay, this is chapter 4, part 2. In the last segment, we're talking about rational choice theory, and it's a general sort of approach that sees human nature in a specific way, that people weigh the costs and benefits of a potential behavior, and they do what they think pays. They go with the payoff, at least as they perceive it. And it would be true for any behavior, not just crime. But Jeremy Bentham, you recall, as a founder of this kind of perspective, applied this logic not only to individual potential criminals, but also wanted to apply it to the criminal justice system. And so he came up with this theory, which has come to be known as deterrence theory. And what I'll do throughout the semester is I try to reduce these big fancy theories down to a single sentence so you can get at the core of what they're all about. It's to simplify, because we want to do that. That's one thing we want to do in this class, is to simplify, keep things simple. So I put here that according to deterrence theory, crime is reduced to the extent that the criminal justice system presents a threat of punishment, that should say punishment, not just punish, that will be one, certain, two, swift, and three, severe. So a couple of things here. Remember that Bentham's logic is that humans respond to incentives and disincentives, and that if it looks like crime pays, that there's more benefits than costs, you're going to get a lot of crime. On the flip side, if you can make crime very costly, you'll get less of it. And so, in focusing on the criminal justice system, he said, hey, if you want to have a low level of crime in society, you got to be tough. You got to impose serious costs so that criminals will decide that it's not worth it, that it's not worth committing the crime because of these three things. If it's certain that you're going to get caught, if the risk is too high, if the chance of being apprehended is too high, that you'll be less, according to Bentham, you'll be less likely to commit the crime. So if you're certain you're going to get caught, even if it's a big payoff, a lot of money or a lot of whatever it is, you won't do it according to Bentham because nobody wants to get caught and, be convicted of a crime and go to prison, that kind of thing. And so he says, number one, if you want to reduce crime in your society, then you have to increase the certainty of getting caught and the certainty of punishment. Number two is that the punishment needs to deter criminals. It needs to happen quickly, swiftly. Punishment must be quickly. So another part of one assumption, an important assumption that Bentham makes, is that not only are human beings sort of weigh the pros and the cons, but they also they focus on the here and now as opposed to the future. It's human nature to focus on, okay, rewards. I want rewards, but I want them right now. I don't want rewards 6 months or a year down the road. I'm more concerned about rewards right now. Same thing with punishments. Is a punishment that's right in my face right now, that's going to have a lot more influence on my behavior than punishment that I don't have to suffer through for 6 months, a year, 18 months, something like that. So that's another part of their theory, is that human nature tends to be focused on the here and now, and that it tends to dismiss or discount, worry less about stuff down the road. So to make criminals convinced that crime doesn't pay, you have to punish them swiftly, as soon as possible after they have committed a crime. If they're thinking that the punishment's going to come quickly, then they're less likely to commit crimes. And finally, number three is severity. And that means sort of like the how nasty is the punishment, how painful is the punishment. And so Bentham says if you want to reduce crime, you have to make the cost of the punishment heavier. You've got to increase the penalty. So usually what that amounts to in current day America is that things like you'd be more likely to be incarcerated, as opposed to a fine or probation or something like that. Um, more likely to get locked up, and more likely that you would get locked up for longer. Or I suppose also the ultimate penalty that you could face, capital punishment, execution, be executed by the state for your crimes. That's pretty severe. That's, consider that to be, in modern times, nowadays, to be the most severe sort of punishment is to lose your life as a result of conviction for the crime. So the logic of this theory is that these three elements are all important to convincing criminals that it's not worth it: certainty, swiftness, and severity. And so memorize those. Those will certainly come up on any quiz. You need to know those three and what they mean. And so if to give an extreme example of what Bentham was getting at here, he said if you don't want to have robberies occur of a local convenience store, in some ideal world, a hypothetical world where you wanted the number of convenience store robberies to go as close to zero as possible, what you would want to do, if you could do it, again thinking hypothetically, Bentham would say something like, what you would want is if any criminal ever decided that they were going to pull out a gun, rob, say, like a liquor store, convenience store, that the moment that criminal exited the store with the money, with the valuables, that he would be instantly executed by the police officers at the scene. So as soon as he stepped out the door, he'd be shot dead. So there you have a very severe punishment, death, for the crime. It happens the instant you commit the crime, you're exiting the store, and that if it happens every time without escape, that the criminal never, ever is able to get away, that he's always, the same thing happens to any criminal who tries it, that they, with certainty, are executed on the spot. So there you have maximum certainty, maximum swiftness, and maximum severity, loss of life. Then Bentham would say, if that's what the society was like and how it handled robberies of convenience stores or liquor stores, that you wouldn't have very many of those sorts of robberies because the certainty's too high, the swiftness too high, and the severity's too high. And Bentham would also say that you're going to get less deterrence. You'll get more criminals if any one of these three elements is weak, is not strong enough. So even if you have the death penalty, like if we go back 200 years ago in England, they had death penalty for everything. You could steal a loaf of bread and maybe get hanged for that. But Bentham would say that doesn't necessarily stop people from committing crimes, even though it's super severe, if they never get caught. If the certainty of getting caught is zero, the criminals know that nobody ever gets caught for the crime, even though it's death penalty, it's not going to stop them from committing the crimes because they are confident that they would never ever get caught. And also, if the punishment doesn't happen forever, doesn't happen for years down the road, then it's not going to work very well either, even if the punishment is really severe. Something like death penalty. If you don't get the death penalty for 15 years after committing the crime, well, it doesn't work very well because criminals, all humans, not just criminals, all humans are worried more about the here and now than they are what's going to happen 15 years down the road. So these three elements work together, according to Bentham, to reduce the level of crime in society. And another way of putting this theory is if you were to ask the question, crime is unacceptably high in my society. There's too much crime, too much violence, too much murder, rape. How can we bring it down? How can we reduce crime? Well, Bentham's answer, whether he's right or wrong, what his theory says, the answer is that you have to clamp down. You have to have a criminal justice system that becomes more certain in apprehending criminals, punishing them more swiftly, and with more severe punishments. That's what this theory's policy recommendations are, is that, if you don't like the level of crime, then you got to get tougher. And on the other hand, if you think that the criminal justice system is too tough and that you could live with a higher level of crime, then Bentham would say, well, you can loosen up and punish less if you don't mind a little bit more crime. If it's super low and you think you could tolerate some more, but you just don't like to see this, this really harsh treatment of criminals with really, really harsh punishments, you certainly could um, loosen up and develop a criminal justice system that was more forgiving, that was less strict. But Bentham would say that you're going to have to live with more crime if you do that. So that's in a nutshell what this. So what this theory is, deterrence theory is, it's taking the rational choice logic, the rational choice approach, but it's applying it specifically to what the criminal justice system is doing. Rational choice can be applied to lots of different things, and here it's being applied to what the criminal justice system is doing in terms of punishment. So it's a specific type of theory, deterrence theory, a specific type of theory underneath this big umbrella, this big broad perspective that we call rational choice. Now, strengths and weaknesses of deterrence theory. We always want to evaluate these theories to put them to sort of like sort out the good ones from the bad ones, the better ones from the worse ones. Well, let me say first of all about deterrence theory is that it's a super uh, important theory in that a lot of what we do in the criminal justice system and have done for really decades and centuries has been based. The criminal justice system is sort of to some extent based on deterrence theory. Why do we punish? One of the reasons why we punish is we're trying to teach people that crime doesn't pay and it's not worth it. We're trying to bring down the crime rate through punishment. So the whole criminal justice system is to some extent based on deterrence theory and based on the idea that you can reduce crime by by more swift, certain, and severe punishment. So let's say before we get into strengths and weaknesses, let's say it's an super important theory, whether you like it or not. It's certainly an important part of our system. And a lot of our system assumes that there's truth and validity to this theory. Now, but let's get into what does the research have to say? What are the strengths and weaknesses about this theory? Well, unfortunately, this theory there's one thing that people like about it is that there's a lot of common sense there. It's very much how people think in terms of common sense. We think of things all the time in terms of reward and punishment. We punish our children to try to stop them from bad behavior. We might punish employees if they misbehave at work to try to get them to straighten out their behavior. We use rewards and punishments all the time to try to correct people's behavior. So it's a very, very much embedded way of thinking among humans. And so again, that's another way of saying that not so much that it's good, but it's popular. It's in people's minds. Even people who don't like this theory tend to think in terms of rewards and punishments quite a bit. So it's definitely a theory that is with us on a day-to-day basis. Okay, now, but unfortunately, this theory doesn't work as well as we would like it to, because a fundamental flaw of Bentham is that he saw humans as being very rational, very careful, planning, and going through every reward and punishment, writing down a list of pros, writing down a list of cons before you ever decide to do something. Well, the fact is that most criminals, common criminals, do not sit down and write a list of, should I commit this crime? Here's 10 reasons why I should. Here's 10 reasons why I shouldn't. Actually, I came up with 11 reasons why I should, so I'm going to commit the crime. That's 99% of the time, that's not what an ordinary criminal does. Crimes are often spontaneous. They're in the heat of the moment. They're done. So violence, especially, is done in the heat of the moment. With people don't think much before they commit the crimes. This is especially true with youth crime, with juvenile delinquency. Young people are especially notorious for their spontaneous, reckless behavior where they don't think before they act. They just jump in and do it and then maybe regret it afterwards. So, especially with certain kind of crimes like violence, common violence, homicide, etc., people a lot of times don't think very much before they commit the crimes. And so they're not really deliberating. They're not rational calculators looking at all the pluses and minuses, right? So Bentham saw humans as being more rational and calculating than they are, especially people who are prone to crime. There is a sort of person who is very organized and plans everything and very much forward thinking and never does anything without, you know, thinking it through very carefully, maybe to the point where it's obnoxious how much they have to plan everything. But most people who are prone to crime are not like that. They just kind of go with they roll with it and they do whatever, they follow opportunities. And if an opportunity to commit an easy crime pops up, they might do it. They might give in to the momentary temptations and commit the crime. So, big weakness of deterrence theory is that people are just not as smart, as rational, whatever you want to call it, as we would like them to be, or this theory assumes they are. So, because of that, deterrence theory doesn't work as well as it should because people are just not thinking about when they commit crimes, they're just not thinking about the punishment. They're not thinking, am I going to get caught? How much time am I going to do if I get caught? How soon is the punishment going to be? They don't think through it a lot. If they did, they probably would be less likely to commit the crimes. But a lot of times people just don't think. So that's a major blow to the theory. There is some, some research shows more effectiveness than other research, but it's to be honest, it's a pretty disappointing theory. And I think at some level, there's at least some basic truth to it because most people would agree, not everybody, but most people agree that if I waved my magic wand and you woke up tomorrow and there were no police officers in the country, let's focus on the United States, no police officers anywhere in the country, no jails, no prisons, no courts, no laws, no criminal laws, no punishments for any crimes, no matter how serious, I think most people would agree you'd get more crime if you had no punishment, no accountability, no consequences by the criminal justice system. Most people would say, yeah, it's going to be a jungle out there. It's going to be chaos if you had no criminal justice system. Most people would agree with that. So I think at a common sense level, most people would agree that deterrence in some way kind of works. That a lot of us, I know myself, it's probably some truth. And I don't know if I've had temptations in my life, but I know that I certainly have been terrified of going to prison because I'm thinking, man, they would just eat me alive in prison. I wouldn't survive. It'd be rough. So it makes me think you better, uh, toe the line and obey the law and be a law-abiding person because you sure as heck don't want to go to prison, right? So I think probably a lot of us folks, if we were ever tempted to commit a crime, wouldn't do it because of fear of punishment. So probably at some level it works, but deterrence works. But the research that's been done is not very strong. And so it's the empirical, the data to support deterrence theory is not as strong as we'd like it to be. It's the theory's good for talking about strengths. It's definitely common sense. It's easy. It's simple. It has simplicity. This certainty, swiftness, and severity is simple. People understand it. They get it. They often think this way because they get it. It's makes sense to people. So, and it also has practical, I would say, a strength of deterrence theory is that it has practical application because you certainly can develop a system to be more. If your crime rate's too high, you can punish more. You can try to support more law enforcement officers out there patrolling, trying to apprehend criminals, and you could support stronger punishment, and you can build prisons and things like that, and lock up more people. You can do that. So it does have practical implications, but it's only to a certain extent practical, because on the flip side of that is that all of these things, police, prisons, jails, court systems, are all very expensive. They cost the taxpayers a tremendous amount of money, and that's not even focusing on how the criminals, families, and people sort of. There's a lot of cost to family members when people get hauled off to prison for years and disappear from society for years, and you don't have contact with them. And when they get out of prison, what's going to happen now? Because nobody wants to hire them. They're going to have a hard time getting a job. So there's quite a few costs imposed. It's an expensive way to try to handle crime. We often fall back on the criminal justice system out of desperation, and we're like, well, we don't know, nothing else seems to work, and so we fall back on the criminal justice system because we have to get dangerous killers off the street and and make ourselves more safe somehow, right? So but it is almost a strategy. Deterrence is almost a strategy of people who just can't come up with something less costly than a punitive criminal justice system. I mean, it does cost taxpayers. Our system each year costs taxpayers billions and billions of dollars, many billions of dollars to pay for all of these different branches of the criminal justice system. So, so there's practicality there, but there's also impracticality. It's a very harsh way to try to reduce the crime problem. So at least that's some of the strengths and weaknesses. It's a complicated thing, but I think the big takeaway, especially for people who haven't studied this before, is that a lot of people don't realize that the research is not super encouraging about deterrence theory being real strong, being that the facts supporting deterrence theory as working really well. It doesn't work as much as we would like it to. Let me stop there. We're getting long, and I should be able to finish up the chapter with one more segment.